As Kevin introduced me, I'm Jonathan Matta. I reside out of the Chicagoland, Illinois area in the United States, and I really appreciate the opportunity to spend about 40 to 45 minutes with you guys. If I go over that 45 minutes, the team here will start throwing stress balls at me. So it's important, obviously, that I stay underneath that time cap. I think I want to preface the dialogue with a couple of things. I am here because I'm really passionate and really excited about what's happening inside education. I approach education first and foremost as a fan, as a father. I'm a father of three, and then as a designer. So my background is in a design philosophy called human-centered design, or I practice design thinking, which is a process that for years I've used with schools to kind of authentically drive pedagogical change by aligning change behaviors of physical space, or the environments that humans and learners interact with. I don't pretend to be an expert, and I candidly don't want to be. You guys know most about what's happening here in your hometowns, far more than I do. So from a verbiage perspective, I'm learning very quickly that some of the things that I say to describe what we see happening in the United States on surface perhaps sound very different and disruptive. But I think when we unpack them, and I'll try and do a pretty decent job today of using some anecdote to kind of draw some similarities to, I think, what's concurrently happening here and then in other parts of the world. I do think from a dialogue's perspective, it's important to stress that this is absolutely a dialogue. And when I say dialogue, I mean it's a small enough group where, by all means, as we go through things, if there's things that pop, if there's things that don't make sense, I'm gonna lean on you guys to jump in. There's manners are great, but try not to have any, and jump into the conversation. One of the things that's fun about a conversation within education, and ultimately what the future of learning might become, is that I do think it's something that we all can share in from a shared perspective and empathy perspective. By show of hands, how many in the room are parents? And then if you want to leave your hands up, how many of you were a student? You two are not, you're not raising your hand. You were never a student? You're the only person ever that has never raised their hand to this. And the idea with this is that ultimately I do think we're a world, and certainly from a United States perspective, we're a world that really struggles with shared perspective and empathy. But I do think education is one of the few things in this world that we all have an understanding of. We either have kids in it, we contribute to it, or we were a part of it, right? So when we consider what the future of learning is, I think it's a conversation that is best served when we all participate, right? One thing, as we try to innovate, is we do face constraints. We do face things that limit our ability to disrupt and innovate and create change. And one of the things that we like to look at is kind of this pairing of tradition with innovation. Sometimes we call that a constraint paired with a bold ambition. And has anybody seen this psychological exercise before? This is the first exam for the day. So we are going to pass this out. Everybody get real tense. This is the opportunity for me to feel like a teacher. So this is a psychological exercise. You will be graded on this. It's called 9 dots. And the rules are quite simple. You are to connect the 9 dots with 4 straight lines, but once you begin, you are not supposed to, I don't want to be that strict, remove your pen from the paper. So 4 straight lines connecting all 9 dots without removing your pen from the paper. And I will give you about a whopping 30 more seconds to complete this on your own. After 30 seconds, if we have not figured it out, I welcome the opportunity for you to collaborate with peers. Or begin collaborating immediately. I like it. Now, I don't want you to feel bad, because we'll show you the answer here shortly. And we're an irrational species. Right now what's happening is our visual cortexes, which dominate our perceptions, is playing a trick on you. And that trick is you're seeing a box. Right? And that trick is the eyes are telling you you're constrained to the interior of that box. So if I tell you to now be rational about this and say you can use the entire space on the paper, right? So don't let yourself be tricked into seeing the box, but rather realize that there's white space way beyond. You guys ready for the answer? I'm gonna, like 5 more minutes, we'll just. Okay, that's how we solve this. Can you see it okay? So to solve this, what we have to do is look outside the box. And the idea with this framing is that it's an orthodoxy, right? And orthodoxies are things that we don't really even question anymore. They're norms, they're practices that we abide by daily, right? And sometimes I think within education, and really all pockets of the world, we can look at disruptors who have come along and challenged orthodoxies, challenged the status quo. And our ask, and what we seek to do as a manufacturer within education, is while we understand that we manufacture furniture, and we do that quite well, it's really to add something more intentional, more meaningfully specific to the disruption that occurs inside education by challenging the orthodoxies with our partnerships.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So by showing you that, the implication today is that you're all crazy, and that we expect all of you to help us change the future of learning. What we're going to do now is actually work through this a little bit as a group. So we're going to challenge some orthodoxies. We're going to give you 2, and a great way to start the framing of challenging of orthodoxy is to do this question of 5 things you would never hear a student say. Now you can do this for anything, right? You could say 5 things my kid would never say, 5 things the kid might say, 5 things my parent would never say, 5 things a teacher would never say. And so the first one we say is, I love behaviorist-based homework. Now behaviorist-based homework implies instruction methods that are rote or transmission-based. I'm doing essentially what I'm doing right now, which is essentially lecturing. You're following, you're going to be tested upon that, and then you'll be rewarded and we'll grade you for it. When we question that, we can ask, why might it exist though? Like why does behaviorist-based homework exist in the world today? The next one that we can talk about is 5 things you'd never hear a student say, I love to sit all day. It's highly enjoyable to sit all day long in class. So when we unpack further, why might the orthodoxies exist? For the first one, I love behaviorist-based homework. It might exist because rote-based pedagogy from an industrial era, right? So in the United States specifically, right, the education system that still largely is in place is one that was designed by Horace Mann. It was designed and put in place to support an industrial revolution. If we look at, I love to sit all day, well, why does it potentially exist? The interpretation might be that lecture is the most effective form to follow and learn, right? To control the masses. When we question it further and you remove it and you challenge it, you can say, what opportunity might we have? Now, as a designer, we use that word a lot. How might we, right? Because it's an open question. So the first one, again, freelance work that is authentic in pursuit. Right? So we start to disrupt and we start to say, well, maybe homework in that linear fashion, that rote fashion, is no longer necessary. And when we remove that, what opportunity do we have? Do we have an opportunity for the student to connect to something that's authentic to them? When we talk about the sitting one, we can say the students are allowed to choose how and where they prefer to learn. So from a furniture manufacturer's perspective, something like the Ruckus collection, right? Or the myriad of different solutions that KI manufactures. Now we see this happening already, right? This happens, we see this disruption happening here, to my understanding, largely in higher education or university. In the United States, while we see that in higher education, we see it happening predominantly at scale in K through 12 or primary. We see a lot of blended learning application in the United States, whereby the homework is not the traditional form of homework, it's largely tech-based, where we're using technologies to replace lecture. Potentially, we're seeing MOOCs or massive open online courses happen and pop up, so that homework looks largely different. I know what my wife and I practice with my own children, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Homework looks very different also. So we challenge it, right? We already know it's happening. When we challenge orthodoxies, one thing that's really important, and we're big fans of, is this idea of situated learning theory. Situated learning theory is the theory that learning is a byproduct of culture, context, and activity. Now, I use my own children's story to explain this. My kiddos go to Huff Street Elementary School. It's in a village called Barrington, Illinois. I have the great fortune to live 4 doors from this school. That's by design, that's intentional, that's how much we believe in the community school. If my children walked 3 blocks, they would go to Grove Avenue Elementary School. If they walked 6, they'd go to Rosalind Road. Now, we live in a village with zoning, and the fact that we've got 3 of the 9 public elementary schools that are part of the same school district, zoning district in the US, is a little bit bizarre in its own right. But what you find is the culture, context, and activities at Huff Street Elementary School are so valuable to some families that they do what my family did, which is say we want to live as close to this as possible. And then at soccer games on Saturday, when we're talking about Huff and we run into friends whose kids go to Grove, they go on and on and on about the culture, context, and activity of Grove. Now we see this play out everywhere, and the significance of it is that when we seek to design change, you have to empathize first and foremost with what that learning culture is, what their situated culture is, right? Because that's how we optimize the innovation, honoring the tradition. I mentioned earlier that I practice design thinking or human-centered design. This is what that circular process looks like. And why we use it and why it works so effectively in helping cultures, learning cultures, change their behaviors, change their spaces, is because it starts first and foremost with empathy. We empathize deeply with the students, their needs, wishes, wants, desires, the faculty or teachers, needs, wishes, wants, desires, administration, needs, wishes, wants, and desires, and potentially and optimally community. Right, the culture of the community around. We create definitions and ideas. Those ideas inform prototypes. In this sense, they can be prototypes to pedagogy, they could be prototypes to space. And then we test them out. This is a very simple thing. Testing out prototypes is just expose it to the human interaction. Let students populate. So when we're faced with the constraints of budgets, when we're faced with constraints of limited space, this process works really well at helping schools, regardless of if it's K through 12, higher ed, primary or secondary, scale some change that's authentic to them. An example of how we use this as a manufacturer is within workshop. So one of the things that we'll do, these are little mini prototyping models. We use 3D printers to scale little prototyping materials. We use a lot of lo-fi making materials like Play-Doh, pipe cleaners, popsicle sticks, and construction paper. And when we engage with a learning culture and we understand cultures are tripping up over change and saying we don't know how to do this, we're stuck here, we're trying to shift towards more of a, I'll make it up, a blended learning model, but we don't know how to prove it if it's working or get there faster. We'll organize that team. Those are tension spots, right? And we'll ask very specific questions of their teams. I mentioned earlier that I don't want to pretend to be an expert. Oftentimes, by democratizing a design thinking process, we empower the users and the teams like you guys here today that care about what the future of learning becomes to solve the problem. We become a facilitator, we become a guide of that process, but ultimately the creative confidence lies in the people that own that culture. And so we harness the power of the teams to critically solve their own problems. We see a lot of stuff in the creative world with Post-it notes and Sharpies. The reason we like Post-it notes and Sharpies is because you could rapidly iterate ideas to questions, and then you can synthesize them. You can organize them into buckets. That's why the Post-it note was designed, to move it around, right? What this looks like then is we ask teams to rapidly prototype. So all those Post-it notes that you saw are synthesized. This team on the right, for instance, it's turned a little bit diagonal. I tried to take a very artistic picture, and I realize now in presentation it's just going to hurt people's necks. This team made a treehouse. And the drivers, based on those questions, based on creatively working as a team to solve a problem that they were curious about, was comfort. And they broke comfort down to cognitive, creative, and physical. And then that impacted the physical space. And so we use this design process to start chipping away at what that authentic situated change might look like for their culture. I mentioned this already, this idea that it's really critical that we empathize with all three parts of this thing. And this is probably not anything, I would say in about 2008, there was a great book published called The Third Teacher. And that book actually 2006, I believe. That book did a tremendous job of laying out 76 principles over the impact that space has when it's aligned with the teaching experience and the learning experience. We at KI call that total participation. I'm going to transition our conversation towards this idea of where we think learning is ultimately going. And to summarize it really quickly, we believe it's from rote to active to freelance. Now, these three metrics, 24, 33, 65, we'll unpack quickly. 24% of the world's population is millennial. 33% of millennials are self-employed. So they're already engaged in freelance work. 65% of current K through 5 age kiddos face jobs that do not exist. So if I say that differently, not 65% of kids, all the kids, right? So if you're a current K through 5 age kiddo, 65% of future jobs, we don't know what they are yet. So as a designer, one of the things that I do is look curiously at what all this stuff means and start to create definitions and ideas. Right? The definition and idea is essentially looking at my own three kiddos. On the left is Ellison, or Elle for short. She's a fourth grader. The little bitty baby looking at her big brother's muddy, sandy hand on a beach is Layton. She's 9 months old. And Nolan's on the far right for you guys, and he's 7 in first grade. Now these are kiddos that face this future. And what's interesting about this as a father is I look at them and I look at what their authentic passions might be. And I'm trying to say, does it fit into a box anymore? Or does it fit into something that they might have to create for themselves? And at the worst case scenario, if we organize an education system that allows for them to express their authentic interest in things, what are we teaching them along the way? Creation, right? And so looking at 2,000 years of teaching and learning, looking at them, looking at that 24, 33, 65, we start to say, what has really happened from a leadership perspective over 2,000 years? And has it been a conversation that has changed, or has it been a conversation that has really always been the same? And ultimately, we break it into two sides. So on your right, you have cognitive active. On your left, you have rote or transmission based. On the right, my belief is that Socrates is really the creator of teaching and learning. He had two primary students, Plato and Aristotle. That method of active or cognitive thinking has been around for a very long time. I would say in about 2008, our world of education got pretty excited about active learning. But it's something that it's not new, right? You've had Descartes, I think, therefore I am. We are a species that thinks about our thinking. That's what makes us a unique species. That's oftentimes what makes us an irrational species. You have John Locke on the other side. What ends up happening then is you start to break into these two models that when we go to challenge orthodoxy today, you can see why it exists, right? You have a behaviorist model, this idea of I follow something, lecture, instruction. I'm tested to ensure that I've learned it. I'm rewarded with a grade. And then that's proven that, again, I've learned something. Now, I would call that hacking or doing, right? We don't necessarily know if that implies any actual learning anymore. I draw an upside down smiley face next to Horace Mann, specific to the US model. That's really not fair of me. At the time when he designed that model of instruction, it was highly beneficial to the United States. It was situated to what we needed. If I look on the other side, you break into a constructivism model. And you had contributors. The most interesting one for me is Vygotsky. He was a Russian scientist that lived a very short life and was really an initial author of project-based learning, or what we call PBL, which we'll talk about in a minute. And what's curious about this is as I look at the 24, 33, 65, I look at Ellison, Nolan, and Layton. And I believe deeply in the emotional side of harnessing the power of your own involvement in education to critically challenge the orthodoxy. And I say, what's happening in today's world of disruption in education? And who's contributing to it? Who are these names today? Who's the Socrates? Who's the Descartes? Who's the Vygotsky? Who's the Horace Mann? And we look at those models and we say, do they fit into any side of this thing? Because for 2,000 years, it's been pretty clean, right? And we start to say, I don't really know. And we look at extremes. Now, IDEO is a global design organization that's authored this great framing idea of extreme users. And extreme users, we use two examples to reinforce what extreme users are. Text messaging was initially designed for deaf users. Has anybody texted yet while I've been speaking? It's totally okay if you have, you're not in trouble. Rishi's been on his phone the entire time.
I'm tweeting in case.
Anthony raised his hand very, very selflessly to acknowledge that he has been texting. And that's okay. I think that's my personal opinion, is that I'm fine with that. Does anybody know what that bottom logo is? And where we see that in life, daily? Has anybody seen that logo in their kitchen?
Yeah, you don't know about our stop keeps.
So we might have to come back to this. I want to learn about this. So OXO Good Grips. That's in the U.S. It's a kitchen utensil company.
Oh yeah.
And I understand it's here. This was designed for arthritic users. So the story on this was a gentleman had a severely arthritic wife. She could not grip a traditional kitchen utensil, so he bought bicycle grips and stuck them on the handle. They had a party. One of their friends was an industrial designer. He said, why do you have bicycle grips all over the wood utensils? He said, my wife's arthritic. She cannot grab them otherwise. He said, I think you might have something here. Let's take it into our studio and try and scale it. So this idea that these things were designed for one very specific person or human, but insights scaled out and have really helped everybody. So if we look at that and we apply that framing and then we look at education and we say, who are the extremes? What do they represent? We start to see this storyline of freelance models, right? New contributors, new creators, new disruptors, who I believe the 6 people who've created these models are named on not active or wrote, but flip it over, write freelance, and these are today's contributors to what I think education will become. Really quickly, on the left, you've got primary or K through 12 models, and on the right you have secondary or higher education. What is really interesting about this is, for the most part, on the right, they're not even fitting into the secondary or like higher education. They're almost graduate level. So we see a lot of innovation and disruption happening in the United States at the graduate level, and then we see a lot of disruption and innovation happening at the K through 12 level, but not in higher education, which to my understanding is the complete opposite of what we see happening here in the United Kingdom. All of the innovation and disruptions primarily happening in higher education. incubatoredu is a 2012 creation. It was a gentleman who had engagements in Silicon Valley and looking at kind of lean startup methodology and how businesses are rapidly evolving, and saying, I don't know if we're teaching this. He made it a selfish project, if you will, and he said, my kids are not learning this. They're learning a dated form of entrepreneurial studies in high school. What if we brought an academic or a business incubator, a Y Combinator, an accelerator type model that you see in Silicon Valley to rapidly grow and develop a business opportunity? What if we brought that into high school? And now 2017, right, 5 years later, the successes have been wild. I mean, you have kids, 16, 17-year-old kids who've created fully established companies that are making money, right? Hack Studio is an after-school program created by a gentleman by the name of Michael Miners. Mike is a serial creative, a very philanthropic man, was very frustrated with his own children's lack of integration into school. They were struggling, they were not fitting into the rote or transmission-based model. And ultimately, he would challenge very respectively teachers and say, how come we can't find opportunities to engage with the kiddo where they're at? If my kiddo loves skateboarding, why wouldn't we individualize it and find a way to tease out the great things that get him excited about skateboarding? Enrich him with the things that you need and want him to learn, but at least give him an opportunity to express himself. Teachers say you can't individualize instruction. It becomes chaotic. I can't have 25 kids all pursuing their own thing. And Mike said, you know what, I'm going to build it and I'll show you. And so the story here is ultimately he's built a studio based on the cultural expectation that you show up to contribute to others first. And what happens is if today I came in here and I said I'm going to contribute to everybody else before I even contribute to my own work, you now live in a society where everybody automatically gets done because everybody's helping everybody else. Now this is a model we see happening in the primary form of pedagogy of project-based learning or maker-centered learning, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is this idea of distributed teaching and learning. We see a lot more peer-based learning. And when you create that cultural expectation, you reduce some of that emphasis of that traditional teacher. High Tech High is a Silicon Valley creation, has ties to Oracle as an organization. There's a great documentary about it called Most Likely to Succeed. Does a better job than I would right now of explaining what that model is. It's very active in maker or project based. If I shift to the right, Experience Institute is a creation by a young man by the name of Victor Saad. Victor, upon graduation from undergraduate, was going to explore a graduate experience and said, I don't know if I want to fit into that box. I don't even know if I fit into that box. What if instead I did 12 one-month expeditions? Things that I really was like a geek for, and I got to dip my toe using that same money into things that I'm passionate about to enrich my experience. Now this is based heavily on apprenticeship at a rapid model. Something similar to my understanding to what you guys have here in an apprenticeship model. And so now he's formalized this. Now they teach things that are very modern. So they teach design thinking, they teach storytelling, they teach lean startup methodology. And what's happened now is it's a formal institute. They're also prototyping to fill a leap or a gap year. I'm a big fan of leap or gap year. I think one of the cruelest things we do as a society is ask a 17-year-old where they're going to college and what they're going to study. I think these guys on the left are doing a great job of exposing kids to agency earlier in life, that 17 or 18-year-old might be able to express enough agency that says this competency partner in higher education is right for me, this field of study is right for me, because I've explored so much. Alt MBA, I am a graduate of Alt MBA. This is a creation by an author and prominent thinker, Seth Godin, out of the United States. Seth's curiosity was, could you essentially take the best practices of a traditional MBA experience, combine them with modern real-world problems, bring together disruptive leaders by way of making people apply to this thing, and then put them as a cohort, put them into a 30-day intense workshop, and have them create 17 actual real-world projects. And so this is an incredible program that is heavily based on reflection and feedback. When you do 17 shippable produced projects that are interdisciplinary in pursuit over a 30-day period, And every project has 5 pieces of feedback given to you, and then you reflect upon that, all your outcomes get better. Right? We do this in work really well. We collaborate really well, optimally, to make things better, right? And this is something that's happening within graduate level. MU is Mission University. These guys were in the class prior to me in Alt MBA and far more brilliant. They said if Seth can do this in graduate school, why can't we do it for name brand higher ed? And so what they're claiming is that they'll do what a name brand 4-year will do in 1 year at the cost of $12,000. Now, all of these guys are generally underpinned by 2 forms of pedagogy currently. We call the one maker-centered learning. Now, in the States, there's this big movement towards maker spaces. Now, maker spaces are traditionally what we would have called like shop class, fabrication labs, potentially learning a trade, right? They're very hands-on, they're very experiential. We have a heavy immersion of technology in these things, so things like 3D printers. In the States, we tell people all the time a 3D printer alone does not make a makerspace, right? You have to underpin that process with some very clear intentional things. And the idea with makerspaces ultimately is that it's curiosity driven. Right? So it's an open, accessible space within an educational facility that allows for the child to show up and express their authentic interest in something. And what happens with that is that we develop agency. Agency is this idea of I know where I fit in within the world, I can express myself in it, and I have creative confidence to do it. And that's the idea of looking at some of these models and saying if we can develop this earlier and earlier and earlier, where might we go? And again, it reinforces this idea of it's a future of freelance. When we start teaching a 7-year-old to find their passion, I have a sticker on my MacBook here. It says Lake Street Skate Club. That is a creation of my 7-year-old and his friend. Right? They sell these things. They sell stickers. We had to review pricing models, and they had to review how to pay a bank back. I'm the bank, by the way. And so the earlier we do that, the earlier we develop agency, the earlier we develop this opportunity for kiddos. It's kind of like the modern day lemonade stand, right? It's just a highly refined model of using everything that we're currently able to access in the modern world. STEM in the US is a big crazy thing, science, technology, engineering, and math. It's this idea that we're enriching the students in fields of study that would prepare them to be a scientist, a technologist, an engineer, or a mathematician. We're a big advocate for STEAM. The A represents arts. Design thinking lies within arts. The idea that if you attach a creative process to a scientist, technologist, engineering, or mathematician, you're probably going to end up with more human-centered outcomes that hopefully help humanity in really great ways. I do think, from my brief visit here so far, I do think the United Kingdom does a tremendously better job than the United States at enriching students in arts exploration and the historical impact that that has in sharing perspective and learning about other cultures. Distributed teaching and learning, we talked about that a little bit already. Project-based learning is the other form of pedagogy that we see actively disrupting and being a part of the underpinnings of some of those models of extreme that we talked about. The biggest difference between project-based and maker is that project-based is a little bit more traditional from a school's understanding in the sense that it's instructionally driven. So the project is actually part of the curriculum plan. So when a teacher is preparing their curriculum plan, or an administrator, a head of school or a principal says, look, our approach is going to be this, and the teachers then go design that for the students, the project lives underneath that umbrella. Right? So it's a little bit different. Now the kid can still express their own curiosity within that framing of a project. So they do make it personal. Reflection and feedback. This is something that the States is having a little bit of a hiccup with. We don't understand how that's a modern form of assessment. How do I grade you in your ability to give good feedback? Now what we see in the working world is we get feedback all the time. It might not be in the way we want. We might be awarded a project, that's positive feedback. We might lose a project, that's negative feedback. Sometimes we don't. We probably are all curious when we lose a project, why did we lose it? Sometimes they won't tell us. It would be great if they did. because then the next time around I can reflect and can I improve my chances, right? I grow. So we're doing this from an instructional perspective. What they ultimately do is this expert level growth within an extended process of a contextual project. So when we talk about like that incubatoredu model and this idea that we're teaching a 16 or a 17-year-old the idea to run their own business, I mean, that culminates in that student and their group being in a suit or dress, standing on a stage, pitching the way you would on like Shark Tank, a television show.
Dragon's Den.
Different name?
Same thing.
Okay, perfect. I have no idea what you said.
Just like Dragon's Den.
Jack O'Dell. This is a wild thing to see. I mean, to have 16, 17-year-olds standing on stage and saying, this is our business and we're asking for $20,000 in exchange for 30% equity, and it's real, right? That's project-based learning on steroids, if you will. All of these things are underpinned by the science of connection. There's a prominent research psychologist by the name of Brené Brown out of the University of Houston, out of the United States. She's got wonderful TED Talks. She's got probably, I think, 2 of the top 5 most watched TED Talks of all time on empathy and vulnerability. And the science of connection lies within that. So for connection to occur, for me to be asked by Kevin to even come here, we have to have some basic connection. So Kevin has to see, accept, and value me as I am. Mutually, I have to see, accept, and value him as he is. Now, when the connection works really well, this makes sense. This is your spouse, this is your children, this is friendship. When you have a disagreement with somebody or you don't get along with somebody, these are all broken, right? There's a very easy thing to see. It just doesn't, one of them or all of them just doesn't work, right? And when we look at those forms of pedagogy, maker and project-based, apprenticeship, here, it's there. You're giving that child the permission to connect to their learning, as opposed to that idea of rote, right? Where we're really taking it away from them. This is a video by Brené Brown on the topic of empathy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. what makes something better is connection.
All right, so from an empathy perspective, one of the things we see, particularly within project-based learning, is what we call the empathy advantage. And that idea of the science of connection and all the things that empathy does to open up kind of advanced or evolved learning, really. That's human-centered. I won't unpack all of these because I've got to get Allison up here. In summary, I will say, we do believe the future is freelance learning. When we look at the etymology of freelance, 19th century medieval times, it was a knight that wasn't sworn to any lord's services. Now we see this already, that 2433, freelance employment. Sometimes I heard on the news actually here in the UK, the gig economy. I think that's the word that we're using here. Not committed to a particular employer. And we believe the future for students is freelance, not siloed in any structure or defined experience. I thank you guys for your time. I believe deeply that the future of learning is freelance, but ultimately one that is ours to make together. Thank you guys.